It's crunch time for the European Union's governments, who are trying to define the bloc's climate targets ahead of this month's COP conference in Brazil. EU ministers in Brussels are pushing ambitious targets to take to the annual UN Global Climate Summit, which they hope will encourage other nations to follow their lead. But there's been widespread disagreement amongst the EU's 27 countries from the outset.
Germany and Italy are worried EU plans to phase out combustion engine cars will cripple their industry. Hungary, Poland, Czechia and Slovakia say EU climate targets are unrealistic and that their energy supplies can't adapt quickly enough. So EU ministers are meeting in Brussels at the business end of the battle on what their emissions reduction targets should be. Last month, the EU Commission President remained hopeful.
We saw support for an ambitious and pragmatic approach at the same time. So we also discussed the flexibilities to get to this goal, first in form of international credits, and second through flexibilities between the different economic sectors.
In order to put forward a unified front on the global stage, EU countries first have to agree to their own internal targets. There's a fixed goal of full climate neutrality in the EU by 2050, already signed off. On the road to getting there, the EU wanted its members to commit to a 2040 target, a 90% reduction on 1990 levels of emissions. But the really complex discussion is about the 2035 target. The proposal was for a cut between a bracket range of around 66% to 72%. The EU already missed a deadline to submit a reductions pledge ahead of the annual UN climate conference. Climate watchers say heading to Brazil without a fixed number target would be a bad look for the EU.
It would be a disastrous a signal to the rest of the world because, the number would be very large and clear. So that would be probably not good for the EU's international image.
EU countries are also negotiating how much they can outsource this problem by paying other countries around the world to plant forests or capture carbon, doing their emissions reductions for them.
That report by Jack Perrick, who joins me now from Brussels. Jack, talks are dragging on. The ministers are still discussing the 2040 target. What are the sticking points?
Yeah, we know that they still haven't moved on from that. I just got off the phone with an EU official that is close to these talks, and they described it as two tribes, the realists and the idealists. This person, to be fair, was coming from one of the member states that would consider itself a realist. These are the countries that say that being too ambitious on the targets, trying to get to this 90% would be stupid if there aren't serious plans in place. This 90% target of emissions reductions on 1990 levels by 2040. One of the things that they're having to discuss is, at the moment, and we know this is one of the complications, is how much they can offset their emissions. Countries like Poland have been public. They say that they should be allowed 10% of their emissions if they pay another country to plant forests to offset the emissions that they themselves are emitting. We understand that France is saying that that number should be 5% of their emissions minimum. Other countries, Germany, for instance, is saying it needs to be down near 3%, that the onus should be on the European countries themselves to restrict their emissions. Now, we know that that 2040 target, I won't explain all of the complications and the reasons why, but they need to agree that 2040 target before they can look at the 2035 target. They can do that through, they don't need unanimity, they don't need all countries to agree for the 2040 target, but it shows that it's already too complicated, even without unanimity. The deal for the 2035 target, which is the one that they need to take to the COP in Brazil, that needs full agreement across the member states. So things are really, really complicated and looking likely to drag on much, much further.
If there is no agreement before COP30, what will that mean for the EU's negotiating position?
Well, it will be a disastrous look, essentially. That's the main problem. The EU sees itself as the climate leader. The Paris Agreement was signed in France, in an EU member state, and they are trying to push other countries around the world to be more ambitious, especially with the United States, with Donald Trump pulling the US out of the climate agreements, China dragging its feet on many of its sort of climate pledges, according to the Europeans and to other member states around the world. So it just wouldn't be a particularly good look for the Europeans. But like I say, some of the EU countries are saying we still need to be realistic. There's the 2050 target of climate neutrality, full emissions neutrality. So that's already signed off on. And a lot of the countries are saying, why are we battling ourselves, needing to try and go through this process, sort of self-flagellating on these targets when we've already got the big target in sight?
That was DW's Jack Perrick in Brussels. Thank you.